Welcome to the Millennial Lawyer Podcast.
I'm Mark Shirian, and today we're talking about what really determines the strength and value of an injury case: investigation, evidence, and credibility. Joining me is someone who investigates injuries for a living. Christopher Davila is a New York State licensed private investigator and retired law enforcement professional. He spent over a decade with the New York City Department of Correction, including senior roles in the Investigation Division and Internal Affairs Bureau, where he investigated serious injuries, use of force incidents, and complex internal cases. Today, he applies that experience to civil investigations, including personal injury cases, focusing on incident reconstruction, credibility analysis, and advanced evidence collection. What makes Chris especially valuable in injury cases is that he understands how incidents are investigated from the inside and how narratives and liability are shaped long before a case reaches a courtroom. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So when you first review a personal injury case, what makes your instincts kick in that the story on paper isn't complete?
Well, I think just experience tells me that the story on paper is never really complete. There are always blanks that need to be filled in. Police incident reports never tell the whole true story because one needs to be detailed but concise at the same time. I always rely on a more holistic approach. Incident reports are a very important part and a necessary piece because it's that one legal document that most attorneys rely upon to move forward. But body cam footage, or BWC, the body-worn cameras, are very important because oftentimes we will hear or see things in those videos that may not be documented on that incident report.
Right.
Sometimes somebody will say something that will corroborate a verbal statement, but that was never documented in that police report. So sometimes I have a police report. I'll call the involved parties, just ask them what happened. And I try to do a lot of listening. Some would argue I talk a little bit too much, and I try to temper that by letting people just kind of talk, because when you just let them talk, they tend to be a lot more free about what they're saying. It's hard because as investigators, I'm sure as attorneys, we tend to want to kind of clarify things as things kind of get said. But sometimes it's better to just let people say what they have to say in their way. Let their narrative evolve organically. And then while they're talking, maybe just make some notes, jot down the key words, and then follow up later.
So walk us through that. So when a personal injury attorney brings you into a case, walk us through your process step by step from that first call.
When an attorney contacts me, it'll depend on what stage of the investigation they're in or what stage of the case they're in. Sometimes a case needs to be investigated from that, what we call the intake portion, where literally it was just thrown on the desk or just reached the desk of the attorney, and they're like, okay, let's go see what we have going on. And they'll contact an investigator and say, can you go out to the location of the accident or the scene of the incident and get pictures, talk to the involved party who will eventually become your plaintiff, try to gather evidence, take pictures. That intake part, a lot of companies do it. A lot of investigators do it. Sadly, or unfortunately, a lot of investigators don't do it very well, or at least they're not very complete. What I do, if that's the stage that at the very nascent stage of an investigation or a case, I'll ask the lawyer for as much information as I can get. What's the name of the person? Do they have relatives? Where do they live? Did they mention anything about cameras being in the area? Oftentimes this is a very emotional process and thing for a plaintiff, an injured party. They'll start emotionally dumping information on anybody who will listen, but they won't necessarily remember everything they said. So I try to encourage everybody at every stage of the investigation, or at every part of the contact process, almost like contact tracing, like we did in COVID, to document as much as you can. I like to keep notes on every conversation I have, even if it's just a sentence, because when I go back, I can see the chronology of the contemporaneous um, gatherings of intelligence I may have obtained, or things like that. So what I try to do is I try to get as much information from the attorney. That way, when I meet with the plaintiff or the injured party or whoever, I can listen to what they have to say. They may have mentioned something that they didn't mention to you, but I can also, they may have omitted something that they did mention to you. So I can kind of try to fill in the blanks a little bit.
Right.
After that, I ask them where it happened. I try to calm them down. I try to say, I try to assuage some of their trepidations. How are you doing? Are you okay? How do you feel? Empathy goes a really long way. Looking at people in the eyes, when you talk to them, and smiling a little bit, but don't be overly giddy, because you're dealing with a person who may have had a catastrophic injury, or maybe recounting the injury of a party who is no longer with us because that injury was fatal. Sometimes you have to listen, be empathetic, be sympathetic, but try to show a little humanity also. I then ask where we are, and I try to take pictures. I take as many pictures as I can, and video. More is more. Less is not more, in my opinion. Later, I'm happy to sift through all the raw data and the myriads of digital pictures and all that stuff. But it's important to capture as much as you can, because scenes change. Sometimes something as simple as the weather can change the way a scene is. And remember, I try to always remind people, much like financial analysts, which I was in another life, pictures are only a snapshot in time. You know, they only capture an instant. They don't capture what happened before. They don't capture what happened after. It's only an instant in time.
That's good.
So, you know, sometimes with taking those pictures right at the scene of the accident, if you're lucky, that same day or within hours. If you're less fortunate, it could be days, weeks, or months, sometimes even years later, which makes it a lot more challenging. But I like to try to you strike while the iron's hot, speak to people, document my conversations with them, communicate those things with the attorney, make sure the attorney gets that information in a timely way, in a clear and coherent way. And then we can kind of sort through it all later. The intake part is a very important part. There are people who do it for a living, only the intake. And there are some people who are, I don't know if the right term would be vertically integrated in this case, but they start from the intake and go all the way through to presentation at trial.
You've handled personal injury cases before. What types of personal injury cases almost always require a private investigator, even if people don't realize it?
I think they all do, and I'm not saying that in a self-serving way. I think that I think that attorneys have a certain expertise. I wouldn't. I've learned a lot working with attorneys, but that is not my core competency. Law, or sifting through the legal mumbo jumbo that's involved in gathering information for a case. What I try to do is I try to leverage my expertise, which is gathering that information, trying to get the information from a lot of different angles. Sometimes that involves, talking to neighboring businesses and just saying, "Hi, how you doing?" And I noticed you have a video up there. You may have heard there was an accident yesterday or this morning. I mean, it was crazy, right? You try to break a little bit of the ice, and hopefully you get some of that footage
Wow.
if you're lucky. Or sometimes you just talk to people and ask if you just sometimes there's somebody sitting out on a stoop, the neighborhood mayor that's kind of watching everything going on. You can't rely 1,000% on eyewitness accounts, but but they tend to know who's around. They tend to be peeking out of their window oftentimes. It's helpful to, I think, really kind of touch base with as many parts of the area, the surrounding environment as you can, and then communicating that with the lawyer. But I think every lawyer should have an investigator or somebody that can um, that can gather that intelligence, that information in a competent way, understands how important it is to provide him. I'll give you an example. Taking pictures. Sometimes I take 50, 100 pictures of one little area. And sometimes one or two of the pictures, maybe 10 of the pictures, are not really well lit, or maybe they are blurry or something. But I provide all the pictures in sequence, because when I'm presenting that to the attorney, everything I do is with the notion or the concept that whatever I provide may be forwarded on to a judicial body as part of the attorney's investigation into the case. So if I have 1 through 10, and then I skip 12, 13, 14, and then 15 through 30, and then 31 and 32, and I may have just deleted them because they were blurry or bad pictures. But then what happens when you present those pictures, and the defense attorney is like, well, wait a minute, you have 100, you start from 1 and you end at 100, but there's 6 or 7 or 10 or whatever number of pictures that are not there anymore. What are you hiding? What? And I'm not saying that that's not something that you can't defend, but who knows? Why give that to them? It's a blurry picture. You can discard that, or video. What I do know, about having analyzed probably thousands of hours of video when I was in New York City, there's always a story before and after, and I try to go back sometimes 10 minutes, maybe days before an incident may have occurred. So things like that.
No, that's very helpful when I get in a case and trying to figure out. Like you said, there's only so much I know, and there's only so much that you know, and we need to do our jobs.
Right. We can stay in our own lanes and still be collaborative and find synergy.
Totally. So why are cases like construction accidents or unsafe property conditions especially vulnerable without early investigation?
When you think about investigating things like that, you kind of have to almost have a cynical mindset. Somebody slips on a wet surface and there was no wet, beware of the wet floors or whatever. If you don't have a picture immediately, somebody may just put one up there.
Right.
Sometimes a defective, I don't know, a sidewalk or a board that may be misplaced that causes people to trip can very easily be fixed or adjusted if you don't get that video or photographic evidence almost immediately, or getting a contemporaneous witness account, somebody that's willing to talk to you at the time, not 10 weeks later, not 10 hours later. If you can get it right then and there, and attest to the fact and affirm that they told you what happened, that helps. I think time is always of the essence. I have cases where I see they tripped on a pothole, or what was it, a sunken municipal plate for water or electricity or something. But we're looking at the case a year later, and that may have been that surface may have been repaved, or the pothole could be filled. It's not that it doesn't take that long to fill a pothole when you're trying to cover yourself. It takes forever when you keep driving on that pothole and you contact your local, your municipality. Can you please fix a pothole? But when somebody gets injured and it's reported, all of a sudden that lights a fire under people to start getting things done, because they want to avoid being on the business end of litigation. So
Right.
I think time is always of the essence.
So let's talk about some of the things that you've worked on. So could you describe a case where the surface story seemed straightforward, but your investigation revealed something very different?
I'll try to be as broad strokes as I can. I don't want to. We had a case where there was um, somebody who was there was a road accident, a car accident, a motorcycle accident. The police report was very general. It didn't provide a lot of detail. It was actually one motorcycle that hit another motorcycle, one motorcyclist that hit another motorcyclist, but there was an obstruction in the road. And the person in the front motorcycle hit that object in the road. He fell. The person riding a motorcycle behind him uh, hit the motorcyclist in front of him. Now that police report did not say anything about that rear motorcyclist having hit the person. When I talked to the person, to the rear motorcyclist, because he was a different party. Our client was the first motorcyclist who hit the obstruction in the road. I spoke to the witness on the second motorcycle and I said, "So tell me what happened. Is everything okay? Don't worry, you're not in trouble," which, he wasn't. He just trying to find out what was going on. He mentioned that his motorcycle wiped out as a result of the motorcycle in front of him having wiped out, but he indicated that he hit the motorcyclist in front of him. That was nowhere in the report.
Wow.
And that changes the dynamic of the case. So sometimes talking to people and getting that account, now that's not enough in and of itself. So you have to get, if there's a police response, you have to get body cam footage, because body cam footage captures a lot of audio, and believe it or not, the audio quality is pretty good. And you listen very carefully. Sometimes you have to listen over and over again. Sometimes you have to kind of distort the picture a little bit because you're zooming in and you just want to see things. It's not always 100% clear. But the person that was on that rear motorcycle indicated, yeah, I hit the guy in front. Now, notwithstanding that person, that motorcyclist telling that to a police officer, for some reason it never found its way into the report. So, and I don't think there was anything malicious about it. It probably just, it just happens. So I think those are the kinds of things that sometimes you have to know how to approach people, gather information, and really listen and analyze.
Besides body cam images, though, how often does critical video or digital evidence exist that no one thinks to request in time?
I'm going to go to the tail end of that question, time. Video gets overwritten very, very quickly sometimes on a 24-hour
Typically, what do you see, though? Because I've heard 30 days, I've heard 200 days, I've heard 7 days, a day. What is it usually?
There is no hard, fast rule. That's the short answer.
Right.
Some city video, to my recollection, I think is, at least in the Department of Correction, I think it was 90 days. 90 days, not 3 months, because you have 31-day months. And some people think, so September 5th, I have October, November, December 5th. No, you have until maybe December 3rd or 4th. Some local stores or businesses may have video footage that overwrites in a lot shorter time than that. I've seen as short as 24 hours. Some people save it to a cloud and keep it forever. It's really a bit of a roll of the dice. Which is why you don't want to throw that. You don't want to roll those dice by saying, "Oh, I'm sure they have it. At least it's only been a week. I can get there next week." No, get there now. Because it could be on a 24-hour overwrite loop. And then where are you?
Well, I've dealt a lot with spoliation motions, which I'm sure you're aware of. And, clients ask me all the time, well, we got to get the video. We got to do this. We got to do that. And what I tell them is, well, if your incident was documented, if there was an incident report, they are under an obligation to preserve evidence, because the way the courts look at it is there's a reasonable anticipation of litigation. So that puts them in a position where they're obligated to preserve video. And I had a situation where a chair, one of my clients fell on a chair and they disposed of the chair and they didn't even preserve the video. But this was reported to, the catering hall where it occurred, and they got rid of it. And we were able to hit them with a spoliation motion, and the judge agreed with us because they were under a duty to preserve that evidence. So I don't know if you ever had to deal with that, but that's the law behind preserving evidence.
Absolutely. And oftentimes, and 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, it would be the attorney that notifies the potential defendant or defendants about the obligation to preserve evidence. Sometimes they need that reminder. But again, what if it's an incident in the street or it happens at the front, at the doorway of a business? Maybe that business has an obligation to preserve the evidence, but what about the surrounding businesses?
Right.
They don't. That they have no obligation other than their willingness to help. So while the business itself has that obligation and may be reminded immediately by the attorney, I like to remind the attorneys also, hey, wait a minute, let's get everybody around. Let's first see if there's any video. Let's talk to people. You can't be getting on the ground and just walking around and talking to people.
Right.
Sometimes people are taking video. Everybody has a video camera. Everybody has a movie camera. This is now a better movie camera than we've seen in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Everybody has, or most people have dash cams. I don't know if it's most, but a lot of people have dash cams. If you find a video where something happens, or it happened on such and such, and then in that video you capture, if you're lucky, a passerby or a car that goes by and you see a license plate, maybe you can find that person and ask them, hey, you were here right at that time. Do you happen to have a dash cam? Did you see anything? Sometimes it takes a little bit of creativity, but spoliation motions, I'm familiar with them, but you don't get them from the surrounding business. You don't have that same level.
Right, because they don't.
It's important, and sometimes you don't even know that a business has a camera. Sometimes you just have to ask, because sometimes cameras are very nondescript and on a wall, on the outside of a building or something. Sometimes cameras are designed to be very unnoticeable. So as not to be obstructive or obtrusive in somebody, what they think, oh, I don't want to feel like I'm watched from that building. But everybody has a security camera, even Ring doorbells or doorbell cameras. If something happens, so most people have those. Why not ask? And they tend to save video. I know for me, because sometimes I can't get rid of all of them. I have I constantly get notifications that I'm getting video of a tree that swayed a little bit too much, or a passing car, or somebody that was knocking on the door to sell something. But a lot of people don't realize they have that video. Worth asking. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.